of what I knew before I came here. And this is the first time I've ever had any backup for what I knew. So let's begin. Part 1. Edgar Cayce, the Sphinx, and the Discoveries in 2003. Back in the 1930s, Edgar Cayce predicted that under the Egyptian Sphinx, there was a hall of records that would be found around 1998. Cayce said it would have the history of our world in it. In 2003, the US government was using ground-penetrating radar to scan our planet when it came across a cavern under a mountain in Romania. There was something in the cavern that defied identification, and they were curious enough to contact Romanian officials for permission to investigate. The Romanians agreed to a joint exploration, and the result was the long-predicted discovery of the Hall of Records. The Romanian government was excited and wanted to tell the whole world, but the US absolutely refused because they felt it would destroy their legitimacy, their hegemony across the entire planet. Nevertheless, in the Bucegi Mountains of Romania was a large cavern about 100 feet high, 300 feet in diameter, and the cavern was protected by an energy barrier that required the raising of one's frequencies in order to enter. Once inside, there were 5 tables lined up along the walls on either side of the cavern. Each table was about 15 feet long, 6 feet deep front to back, and 6 feet high, obviously built by people who were taller than we are. Each table had a narrow slot in the top, a couple centimeters wide, and I guess, I don't know how many centimeters long, 6 or 8 centimeters long. And when someone passed in front of a table, a 3-dimensional, full-color holographic projection was activated, presenting aspects from various scientific domains. These projections were interactive and seemed to be dependent on whoever activated them. Each table presented projections related to a different subject, and some of those subjects were the history of our planet, the history of our solar system, biology and anatomy in depth, genetics, physics, cosmology, astronomy, architecture, technology, ancient civilizations, religion, and intelligent beings from other star systems. It was an entire library of the universe, put together by beings who were extremely advanced technically and spiritually, and left inside the mountain for us to find. In one area of this cavern, there was a piece of technology that maintained the energetic balance of the tectonic plates on which Romania sits. Messing around with the technology could cause the entire area to sink and fill with water. Perhaps this was set up to be able to sink the entire area if the technology should fall into the wrong hands. In another area of the cavern was an amphora, which is kind of like a vase, about 1.5 feet high, containing exquisitely pure monatomic gold. Monatomic gold is used to regenerate the body, accelerate the development of consciousness, and create extraordinary longevity in the individual who ingests it. Although David Hudson discovered monatomic gold in Arizona at least 25 years ago, he was so hounded and so harassed that he went underground in an effort to disappear. And I think that was after they burned his house down. Very few people ended up hearing about what is called white powder gold, or understanding its enormous power to create an immediate Kundalini experience that transforms consciousness. I do believe there is some stuff out there now called ORM, O-R-M-E, some other stuff called ORMUS. That also is white powder gold, but it's not nearly as pure, and it has a different structure. So it doesn't have quite the same effect. In another area of the cavern, a small projection dome displayed the entire history of mankind, how we began hundreds of thousands of years ago, and what our true history has been right up to 500 AD. Perhaps our true history stopped at that point because we were not to know the more recent actors, elements, and events that have gone into creating our present experience. And perhaps we must discern for ourselves what's happening and make decisions based on that discernment. It's also interesting that the information coming from the Bucege mountain complex only goes up to 500 years, because in the work of Dr. Anatoly Fomenko, the Russian mathematician, and his team of 150 scientists, and his amazing series of books titled History, Fiction, or Science, he declares that there is an error in the timeline of history that has added almost 1,400 years to our history, at least 1,400 years. If that turns out to be true, then perhaps the information in the Bucege complex is correct and up to date. If we remove the 1,400 years that Fomenko says are duplicate years, maybe we'll discover that we're really only at 500 AD. So moving on to the back wall of the cavern, there were openings to 3 tunnels. The one on the left connected to Egypt and an area under the Sphinx, where a chamber lined with thousands of platinum plates, similar in size to a compact disc, were found. The tunnel on the right had several branches going in several directions. One branch of the tunnel went to somewhere in the mountains of Tibet. Another branch led to somewhere in the Gobi Desert. And another branch went to an area under Baghdad in Iraq, where more plates were found. These plates, instead of being platinum, like they were in the first tunnel, were transparent and looked crystalline. Some of these plates could be pressed. You would just press on a corner of the plate using your finger, and that would produce holographic images displaying detailed information about the history and all of the subjects already mentioned above, and then some. A lot of these plates were removed from the caverns at the end of the tunnels and taken to Washington, D.C. for study and analysis, but none of this has been shared with us. Instead, it was classified beyond top secret for fear that the information would affect America's position or her power around the world. The third tunnel, the one in the middle, went deep into the earth, where several cities existed and were populated by highly spiritual humans whose ancestors had fled wars and cataclysms that took place on the surface of the planet. The first city, named Tomasis, was fairly close to the surface of the planet, and their people not only brought their children to the surface, they themselves sometimes spent time working in the surface world to fulfill various missions, sometimes for several years at a time. A second city, named Apelos, was much deeper and was made of a crystalline material. They also maintained a quiet but busy presence on the surface, even getting supplies from some of our systems of trade and transporting them to their people below. A third city named Shambhala was deeper yet and had an even higher frequency in terms of consciousness, but nothing more was said about it other than the fact that communication with the surface had broken off a very long time ago. The people in all of these cities were telepathic, peaceful, youthful, very healthy, and very supportive of the development of the consciousness of those living on the surface of the planet. That's us. In later travels to the cities in the inner earth, it was revealed that the discovery of the cavern and its advanced technology was not accidental. The city officials of Tomasis and Apelos said that the discovery of the cavern, the advanced technologies, and the holographic records were tied to a massive effort on the part of highly developed beings who were working to expand consciousness and awaken spirituality around the planet. This effort was needed in order to counter certain elements trying to take control of the planet. So they knew. To date, much of this is still unknown by the majority of the population. Our true history and our beginnings as humanoid beings are still hidden. The presence of other people from elsewhere in the galaxy is still being denied, and our potential to develop consciousness and evolve into people of beauty, wisdom, and power has been deliberately and carefully covered up. The cover-up was maintained by a race of aggressive beings who targeted our planet, and that I have already talked about in a couple of earlier videos. Those beings had implemented a long-term plan to co-opt many of our most successful people, bribing them with money or coaxing them into compromising situations and then blackmailing them, always maintaining a stranglehold on the truth. These invaders slowly built a global honeycomb of intertwined corporations that we came to rely on in order to survive. Their plan was to eventually collapse this corporate honeycomb, leaving people to survive on their own, clearing the planet of millions of people, and instituting an entirely new form of governance, taxation, and control. Unfortunately for them, we are a relatively new form of humanoid that is extremely resilient, rambunctious, incredibly curious, and somewhat rebellious. This is something they did not count on. So let's go on to the next part and take a look at how we came to be this way. The title of this is Planet Earth, Her People, Their History, and the Current Dilemma. Part 2, Zecharia Sitchin, Enlil, and Enki. In the late 1970s, Zecharia Sitchin began writing a series of books about the Sumerian culture. In those books, he talked about extraterrestrials having come to Earth for the purpose of mining gold, and were dealing with primitive humans who were helping them to accomplish this. In Sitchin's story, there were two sons of those extraterrestrials. The sons were named Enlil and Enki, and they were somewhat competitive with one another. For reasons that were not clear to me in the story, Enlil ended up being the favorite son of his father and was chosen to rule. Enki was portrayed as being an excellent engineer, very capable, and working very hard to help the people build roads and canals, but he was secondary. When the Great Flood occurred, Enlil and Enki withdrew to their ship, and almost all of the humans died except for Noah and his family. While certain names and concepts in this story did exist, and some of the events did occur, the story presented by Sitchin is not exactly as it happened. The following information comes from the holographic records shared by the people from Apelos, deep in the earth. And they say the real story starts nearly 433,000 years ago, when a particular stellar alignment occurs between a group of stars, causing the stellar rays from each star in the group to converge onto one small planet, the planet Earth. This convergence of energies sparks the ability of carbon atoms to form a wider variety of covalent bonds. The group of stars that gradually moved into the powerful alignment was known as the EI group. And over the next 10,000 years, there was a gradual change in the DNA of the primate life forms on the planet. Although very subtle, the DNA changes began to accelerate the evolution of those primates, making them more dynamic and more sensitive. 10,000 years later, the effects of this stellar alignment had allowed the DNA and its features to evolve and build out within a small group of primates to the fullest degree. Following that, they continued to develop naturally and normally for another 50,000 years. And then a series of events occurred that would change everything. Around 372,500 years ago, a space war in our solar system caused considerable damage to a Syrian ship. The big ship was named the Nibiru, and it needed metal ores for repairs, especially gold. The ship was only a little smaller than our moon, so this was a long process of shuttling groups of Syrian workers in small ships to the surface of the earth to mine ores from the area of the Arabian Peninsula. The Syrians were not well adapted to our atmosphere and could only work for short periods of time each day before having to return to their ship to recover. While working here, they noticed the curiosity of some of the big primates who were watching them from a distance. And one day, Tenakau, the man leading the mining operation, got the idea that perhaps the Syrians could get help from those primates. They, the primates, were perfectly adapted to the Earth environment, and they seemed curious about the mining operation, but were quite fearful. The Syrians were experts at using frequencies, and Tenneco's thought was to broadcast frequencies that would eliminate any fear held by the primates, allowing the Syrians to perhaps teach them how to help with the mining. The Nibiru also positioned itself in our solar system in such a way that it was able to emit specific frequencies that would further advance and accelerate the development of the small group of primates they were targeting. This effort worked. And now the DNA in the group of primates targeted took on the designation of EN. In other words, when extraterrestrials make a change, they record that. Everything is tracked and recorded very carefully. As Tenneco and the ship continued to broadcast frequencies of joy, not only did the primates enjoy the work, but this state of emotional joy further refined and upgraded their DNA. Tenneco was keeping the ship's commander and the doctors on board the Nibiru informed of what he was doing, probably because advanced civilizations with an ethical orientation are very conscious of how precious life is, and they would not have wanted to harm the primates. The doctors then suggested that they create a group of clones using some of the DNA from the more evolved primates who had responded well in the EN frequency group. This was also successful. When their success in accelerating the development of the primates was reported to the wise council on their home planet, they received permission to combine Syrian DNA with primate DNA. They were then ordered to keep going with the project to develop the primates here and to support all activities that would result in an evolved being on this planet in the future. Over the next 1,500 years, the Syrians continued to work here, and while doing so, did extensive crossbreeding and genetic modification to develop clones that could not only help with mining and repairs to the ship, but would eventually also be able to hold the advanced consciousness of someone from the Syrian civilization. To accomplish this, the Syrians began to study various stellar configurations and genetic outcomes, looking for the exact moment in time and space in which they could create a powerful effect on the DNA of the EN primates. They settled on two possible stellar configuration moments and then used both of them to impact the target DNA. The result was two distinct lines of DNA development. One was designated the ENL group, and the other was the ENK group. So you can see, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, and L. The K and L are just two designations that say, okay, these guys have had further modification. Those in the ENL group had an energy field that was quite large and very refined, with a wide range of frequencies. They were quite tall. Many had platinum blonde hair and green or blue eyes. And they were able to be comfortable and to move easily through both the physical and etheric levels. They lived very long lives, hundreds of years, and spent much of it in a state of joy, which further advanced their consciousness, although they could not procreate. Because of the refinement of their DNA, the ENL group was able to enter dimensions that had a much higher frequency. They were able to communicate easily with the people from Sirius or other star systems, and they often lived around the Syrian bases and worked together with them. The ENL line was highly prized for further hybridization with Syrian DNA, and by 371,000 BC, the goal of the Syrians was finally reached. Tenakov's consciousness was successfully copied into a body that could hold the high frequencies of Syrian consciousness. Their first successful model was named Adam. And to this day, our religions have kept this name in their creation stories. However, there were many more versions that were needed to refine this new human, many more versions before they were able to create a viable woman, and still more versions before these prototypes were able to reproduce. Their offspring received ongoing evolutionary frequencies being transmitted by the doctors on the Nibiru, thus creating a steady improvement in the consciousness of this line. The ENL group became known eventually as the NL line, and eventually this became the Enlil group. The ENK group had a different set of circumstances. These people were much shorter, more muscular. Their energy field was much smaller and coarser, and they were quite hairy. Their frequencies were not as extensive or refined, leaving them unable to access the dimensions having higher ranges of frequency that were part of the etheric level. Because of the low level of frequency in the ENK bodies, Syrians and other extraterrestrials could not incarnate in them, nor could they communicate easily with them. Those born into the ENK bodies were restricted to only the physical level of existence. Since they could not see or communicate with the more highly evolved beings, they could not understand the need to develop themselves so that they too could enter the God state. As a result, they preferred to worship their own assortment of gods and used wealth, sex, and control as their goals in life. For these reasons, this group was mostly ignored by the Syrians when it came to further research and development. The ENK branch continued to evolve at its own natural pace without any further help from highly evolved DNA or external intervention. They became known as the NK group and eventually the NK group. And they did the great majority of physical labor needed by the Syrians who built whole cities here in order to continue their research. The Enki were much more sexually active and soon outnumbered the Enlil beings. There was an effort to keep the two groups apart, but this was not followed, and there was a considerable amount of sexual activity between the Enki branch and the Enlil branch, along with some concern that the high consciousness of the ENL group would be brought down by the ENK group. This did not happen, and a great diversity of DNA continued to expand. Once stable forms of the new human had been created for the Earth, a number of other extraterrestrial races who were in full support of the project began arriving to help stabilize the new civilization by incarnating in the new bodies as they became available. People migrated to Earth from Sirius, Arcturus, the Pleiades, Andromeda, the Centauri systems, and beyond. As time went on, many civilizations rose and fell, some being mainly physical, others being based in some of the higher frequencies of the etheric realm, and some comfortable in both. In practical terms, this meant that people of lower frequency mixed daily with those of higher frequencies. In other words, people based in the third, fourth, and fifth dimensions lived together, built third, fourth, and fifth dimensional cities, and moved back and forth among them without difficulty. There were a number of people with greater sensitivity to frequencies who were able to recognize locations on the planet where you could walk through a frequency portal and find yourself in another location on the planet or in another dimension of people and be quite comfortable there and knew how to return. This meant that those who maintained higher frequencies could move back and forth from the physical dimension to the etheric dimension without a great deal of difficulty. For thousands of years, this ability to enter and be comfortable in the cities of varying etheric densities was common. However, as the population of humans grew, so did the wars of those with lower frequencies. Those with higher consciousness would often seek refuge from the fighting in the quiet, peaceful cities of those with higher frequencies. The etheric city that we are most familiar with, perhaps some of us, is the city of Shambhala. Up until about 27,500 years ago, it was part of Earth and was simply a region where people of high frequency consciousness lived in peace and simple abundance. However, as the frequency of Earth fell due to the expansion of many conflicts over physical property, resources, gods, and control, Shambhala and other high frequency locations began to withdraw from contact. Over a period of several thousand years, there was less and less moving back and forth between the two dimensions. And by 25,000 BC, Shambhala was completely disconnected from the physical plane. There were now only two ways to get to Shambhala. One was to raise the frequency of your consciousness deliberately, and the other was to accidentally stumble through one of the frequency distortions that allowed immediate access. Shambhala still exists and is populated by highly advanced beings, having a greatly evolved consciousness, and who hold the hope that those still on the surface of Earth will reach a high degree of spirituality and the technological development that goes with that spirituality. Other fourth dimensional cities are still in contact with us. They hold the same hope, but they stay carefully hidden. And they have developed extraordinary technologies and use energy systems to block access to their locations. After all these thousands of years and the slow, messy, but ongoing development of the ENK branch of humanity, those who first seeded us are astounded at our sturdy reliance, our ability to adapt, and our slow but sure evolution of consciousness. Where we were at first relatively ignored and left to survive the best we could, now we are watched, supported, and helped. The help is not necessarily overt and obvious, but it has become clear to those of the highest councils that we represent the possibility of becoming beings who are highly evolved and also very accomplished as physical beings. Since most evolution of consciousness results in enlightenment and the transformation to a body of light, the idea of a people who maintain their physicality, yet reach the powerful stages of the God state, is rather rare. And yet it is what we are being guided toward. The hope is that we will someday travel the stars and nurture other physical dimensions that are just getting started or just waking up. And I'm going to close by reading a couple pages from Forgotten Genesis. This is part of the Transylvania series. And I want to read it as a reminder to pay attention to the subtleties of life on this physical planet. And this is reading from pages 72 to 74. This should give you an idea of the kind of world we live in and that we can become aware of and sensitive to. It's kind of an interesting story. In a German city, there was a very old house built almost 300 years ago. Having been rebuilt and renovated several times, it somehow kept its late medieval appearance. The problem was that it was in a demolition area where a large park was planned. The surrounding buildings, all very old, had already begun to be demolished, but that house was well defended by property law. Besides, it also had a historical protection status. Discussions, proposals, and even legal proceedings had gone on for many years, but no one had ever seen the owner. Lawyers said that he was always abroad, being an important businessman who did not want to sell or give up that old building. In the legal papers, it appeared that he had inherited the property, with all of the other papers referring to the descendant. It seemed to be a problem with no solution. At one point, the city officials asked the police to do some discreet research because, despite the efforts of state officials, they were unable to contact the owner of the house to conduct direct talks and negotiations. Any such dealings at the order of the owner were to be done only through the law firm. After a time, however, things became very strange. Taking advantage of the cameras already fitted for the future park, discreet observation of that house began. The reports indicated that it was not inhabited during the first 4 months of 2005. Then, at the end of April, the first person, possibly the owner, went inside and came out only 4 days later. In the summary note received from a colleague, the police report stated that the man who had entered had no luggage and wore only a raincoat over his clothes. There were obviously no goods in the house because it had remained uninhabited for months. Even so, the man did not go out until 4 days afterwards. The police became suspicious and informed the BND, some sort of a Secret Service organization, believing that the situation contained a certain risk of terrorism or other dangerous actions. The observation of the house continued, but this time with superior technique and Secret Service personnel dedicated specifically to that operation. The house was again deserted. But in just 2 months, another person, a tall, brown-haired man with a backpack, was seen entering it. The team carefully monitored the house for the next 7 days without seeing lights, movement, or other people entering or going out. Intrigued by the unusual situation, the head of the team made the decision to penetrate the inside. Additional outside help was called upon for observation, and the German team ended up being 10 in number. On the other side of the ocean, the situation was slightly different. While the Germans merely observed a building, the FBI actually chased a suspect. He was a tall, brown-haired man with unnaturally white skin who did not appear in any civil or visa records of the United States, but he had been involved in a particular accident. He had been sporadically observed from 2003 to 2005 in various cities on the East Coast of America, but each time he was lost. The case was solved in 2005 when an alert was given that the person had suddenly appeared in Detroit, whereupon he was arrested. The FBI team, however, wanted to closely follow the subject to see if he had any associates. Additional trigger forces had been mobilized so that the character could no longer disappear, as had happened before. The man was traced to a house in a neighborhood near the outskirts of the city, where he entered alone. A special FBI intervention team of 7 members then arrived and were strategically placed around the building. What developed from that point precipitated even more confusion. Reading the American report, Radu, the man writing this, says, I have a global vision of what happened there, but none of the parties involved, neither the Germans or the Americans, knew each other. When 6 members of the German team, they're back in Germany now, entered the old Bavarian house, they found no one there. The rooms were large enough, measuring about 3 meters high, and were modestly furnished. 4 of the German agents walked into the middle of the house through a hallway that led them into a room that was larger than the others and that was placed perpendicular to the direction from which they had entered. On the opposite wall, they saw an ordinary door located exactly at the center of that wall. The only strange aspect was that on the side of the door facing them, there were ingrained stones on the wall that were just like those from a river at the base of the house. The German agents then became tense as they heard voices on the other side of the door, addressing them in English in a very commanding tone. The U.S. report mentions the hot part of the operation as follows, quote, the German team violently broke the wooden door between the 2 rooms, being prepared for automatic weapons. Our team, more specifically 3 of the 4 agents who entered the house, also had their weapons on the door because we heard voices giving orders in the German language. They had 4 agents and we had 3. At first, we all screamed at each other to drop the guns. But in all of that tension and agitation, neither side could understand anything. Then we suddenly stopped because we were all stunned. The German and American operatives were facing each other after finding each other in a large but completely empty room. What follows is a fragment from the summary of the German report, according to what the team commander said. I looked in the room from behind one of the windows. It was evening and was raining hard. Our clothes and equipment were getting wet. When I turned my head to view through the window inside the empty room where the American agents were, I saw it was noontime. The sun was shining in a blue sky. None of us could articulate a word. I knew that the images were being transmitted in real time, but everyone was silent during those moments. The surprise was colossal. In the report, it was mentioned that when agents were at the broken door, that is, when interacting with interdimensional space, the image was distorted, but it was still possible to distinguish what was going on there. And after the portal was entered, the images returned to normal. Obviously, that house contained an actual portal, a distortion. That is a spatial portal between 2 worlds, one side in Germany, one side in Detroit. So there's more, but I'll end it there. I just want you to understand that if you can pay attention, be a little more sensitive to the world around you, there are what I call portals, distortions. I call them hybrid areas that you can move through. and be somewhere else on the planet or in some other planet altogether. So I will close there. Let's move on to the next part. The title of this is Planet Earth, Her People, Their History, and the Current Dilemma. Part 3, Before I Came Here. What I share in this part is a combination of what I knew before I came here, some of what I learned at the time of my Kundalini awakening, where my consciousness had no boundaries, and some of what I've learned since then. So I think it's really important to say when advanced races plan something, they go to great lengths to pay attention to every single detail involving the energies they are setting in motion. In my case, there was great attention to the timing of the conception. Even more attention went into making sure I would be born at the stroke of midnight, because that moment is between the two worlds, so to speak. Although it would probably be better to say that it was exactly the point at which the sun was going down and the sun was coming up. This also created a certain kind of bunching up of planetary effects, known as a Kundalini chart in terms of astrology. And this would result in the full spontaneous awakening of Kundalini needed to provide the insight that would expand and advance consciousness. My parents were carefully chosen for specific qualities, strengths, intelligence, and the lifestyle they would choose, which would keep me close to Mother Nature and form the first set of roots in the physical dimension. One of my parents was a Virgo, very practical and very quiet. The other was a Libra, very balanced, also quiet, and yet very creative. They also had specific strains of DNA that were rare and hard to find. My mother's line of people migrated out of Central Europe and into Germany, bringing a very ancient DNA with them that had no primate DNA in it. My father's line of people were the people of Cali, who migrated to Ireland, bringing another ancient DNA bloodline of highly spiritual people whose DNA was mixed with several different races of extraterrestrial descent. Neither of my parents knew anything about DNA or their bloodline history, but this is of great concern to advanced races embarking on a project because they know the significance of DNA. They know that DNA responds directly to frequency. And to them, reading someone's DNA is like a musician reading sheet music in order to play the piano. The advanced races read DNA and know quite accurately how a being will behave and how their consciousness will unfold. It's all based on the energies in play at the moment of conception. My childhood was normal for the 1950s, although several things stand out in retrospect. One is that I used to lie in bed at night and experience something I called getting heavy. I didn't know it at the time, but I was practicing expanding my consciousness into various levels, especially theta, or sometimes much higher, or leaving the body and feeling the thrill of a sudden return in which you feel like you are falling through space. Another was the habit of needing to go running through the fields in the woods after school, thinking I had only been outside for a few minutes, but noticing that it was already getting dark and then worrying that I had missed supper. Yet another was an odd little moment during a piano lesson. My piano teacher was also my voice teacher, and we were sitting at the piano when she asked me to hum for a few seconds, and to hum using my natural sense of tune. When I did so, she looked at me and made the remark, you are from the E group. This comment struck me so deeply that I was almost paralyzed for a moment. She didn't say, oh, that's the key of E. She didn't say, oh, that note corresponds to the E on the piano. She said, you are from the E group. And then we went right on with the piano lesson. I never forgot that moment, even though I didn't really understand what that meant until many years later. When I was 31 years old, I experienced a sudden and spontaneous awakening of Kundalini. And immediately after Kundalini, I knew the following: that I was in fact part of an E group of frequencies, even though I still didn't know exactly what that meant. That I was a member of the Pleiadian group who was here working to expand the consciousness of humanity. That my name was Oelilo Me Makumrak, and that I was originally part of the L family of humans, although I did not really know what that meant either and would not know for many more years. I knew that I was here to teach the world about the mind and consciousness, something I've said regularly. I knew that transformation of consciousness over the entire planet was the goal. And to achieve this goal, it would be necessary to be extremely healthy in mind and body. I knew that my longtime dream of being a traveling doctor and writer was somehow involved in this goal. I knew that I would come to understand frequencies in intimate detail, and that the transformation of consciousness was dependent on the ability to move one's attention into higher frequency ranges. I knew that different kinds of perception were available at different frequencies, that we were meant to unfold through stages of development that led to the capacity to become immortal, that the entire mass of humanity was suffering from arrested development. I knew that thought was the mechanism that maintained the physical body, and that feeling was the mechanism that allowed for continuous return to balance and health. I knew that focus and continuous adjustment led to power and the unfolding of the advanced skills built into every human. I also began to understand the reasons for a few other things in my life. My first name, Penny, which I had always considered to be somewhat corny, was chosen as follows. My first initial, P, was the symbol of someone who can see the future, and that is an interstellar symbol. The next two letters, EN, indicated information about my DNA group. Together, those first three letters, PEN, represented a reminder that I would write. The last letter, Y, symbolized a funnel based in higher realms and channeling higher frequencies into the lower dimensions. And lastly, the sound of the Y, which sounds like the E, was a reminder that much of my work would be done electronically, in the same way that the word email indicates electronic mail. My second name, whose initial is L, symbolized that I had first incarnated into the L family of DNA that was originally formed mainly from extraterrestrial DNA with a small amount of primate DNA mixed into it. And my last name, Kelly, had the initial K, which symbolized the energy of life, the transformation of consciousness, and a flow of support from higher dimensions to those seeking help with the transformation of consciousness. The next two letters, EL, reinforce the combination of frequencies found in the EN group with the L family of DNA. And the name overall, Kelly, is an Irish derivative that began as the people of Cali, then later was shortened to of Cali, and then to O'Cally, and then to O'Kelly, and finally just Kelly. Kali is the goddess of time, who is in charge of creation and destruction because she knows how to create and shift frequencies. And the concept of time arises from how long a set of frequencies last before they change or die out, thus creating something new, which is when we say, times have changed. And really, it's the frequencies that have changed. I would be born into a family in which my grandmother would be named Ida, as a reminder that powerful Kundalini energies would come into my life. I would marry a man named Keither, as a reminder that my work was to help people understand the ancient spiritual teachings associated with the tree of life, and to reach for those frequencies in everything they did. After Kundalini began, I started exploring the universe out of sheer curiosity. In doing so, I went through the black hole at the center of the galaxy and discovered, it just took you to another place in the universe. I went into the center of the earth and discovered it too was just another black hole, but it had a really thick, crusty event horizon that people, including us and others, OPs, ETs, were living on and in that crust. I traveled to other planets, visited other dimensions, met other beings from elves to giants to super beings to a variety of humanoids. I visited family and friends who I thought had died and discovered they were alive and well and still had bodies, but those bodies were much less dense on the other side. I visited a place I called the New Earth and was invited to stay and help create. I discovered a crystal city that had an extremely high frequency range and was inhabited by very spiritual beings. I just didn't know the name of it. I communicated with people that most of us think of as either other dimensional or extraterrestrial, and I knew that we had been seeded by them and were being helped to evolve by them because they were fascinated by our resilience and adaptability, even though we were only physical and had a fairly low consciousness. Their interest in us became intense once they recognized that we were surviving and learning without much help from them. What they were fascinated by was our amazing resilience, our energy, and the extraordinary adaptability we demonstrated. The idea took shape in their minds that not only might we supply them with some of that spunky DNA, but that we showed the potential to evolve into extraordinary beings who were mainly physical but could work in and with the light. Some beings evolved to become only light, leaving their physicality behind. However, they are then too frail to spend time in a physical system, making it difficult to help those systems evolve. In some of my other videos, I have mentioned that some races of humanoids evolve only their technology to an extraordinary degree, and then use that technology to beef up their physical bodies and achieve great longevity. Many of these become aggressive and live by force, making them completely unsuitable for assisting young civilizations. The hope held by those watching us on planet Earth is that we will maintain our physical resilience and begin to develop our consciousness so that we will enjoy the best of both worlds. The hope is that we will join the family of star nations and be willing to eventually nurture and teach other groups of people elsewhere in the cosmos who are coming up through the system of refinements that lead to the God state and the full flowering of humanoid consciousness. Lastly, I remembered a number of my lives before coming into the Earth system and re-experienced a life in the area of Mongolia that was highly developed, but not completely in the physical dimension. In Consciousness and Energy, Volume 3, I described what I remembered of my experience there, but I didn't say anything about the fact that the reality there seemed to be in a higher range of frequencies, or that our bodies were slightly less dense. I didn't mention that we had access to extraordinary technologies, as well as full access to the frequencies and materials of the physical world. I did mention that there were people who came to learn in the schools of consciousness we ran, but I didn't mention that they were people who lived entirely in the material plane. They had access to our cities and schools. We had access to theirs, and there was a great deal of sharing and commerce between the two dimensions. This ended when we withdrew because of Earth changes that had begun, and consciousness fell. People were completely focused on survival, housing, food, and other necessities. Eventually, they forgot how to raise their frequencies and ended up completely caught in the lower dimensions of the physical realm. I bring up all of the above because it was my personal experience, and I thought it was all just too strange to talk about it much. However, all of it was backed up in the set of books known as the Transylvania series. So now I'm feeling a little bolder. I brought up some of the information in the Transylvania books and even Sitchin's work, which I never really appreciated until now, because I think they contain information that everyone should know about. The information they share has implications that we would do well to understand, because I think it will help us to break the stranglehold that religion, government, media, medicine, and corporations have on us. So let's move on to the next part, part 4.